The Schiller building is one of the great examples of technology from a number of different sources being integrated into one building. And its achievements were primarily both underground and above ground. So in the foundations, it relied on a system of piles that had been used before in the poor soil of Chicago, particularly under grain elevators, but never in a building as large as the Schiller. This was important because Chicago's poor soil had meant that previous buildings had to put very, very carefully calculated loads onto the soil. And this discouraged buildings with different forms of towers or unequal heights. So the Schiller's tower and its theater are very different in the loads that they put on the foundations. This wouldn't have been possible with the old systems of raft foundations, but with pile foundations, they could establish a more secure base and build a greater variety of forms. The other great achievement is the transfer of bridge technology, in particular steel trusses, which not only bridge the theater, provide the theater its roof, but also support a major part of the office building. The connecting piece of the office tower actually bridges over the theater. And to achieve this, they had to rely on technology that had been developed for railroad bridges, trusses. Applying those in an architectural setting was relatively new. The hidden hero in both of these was William Sui Smith, who Adler and Sullivan consulted with, hired as a consultant, both for the foundations and for the bridge trusses. Sui Smith had been an expert in underground construction. He was responsible for engineering tunnels in New York and Chicago, and he had a very, very particular feel for what would work in the poor soil of Chicago, one of the unsung heroes of that era of construction. I think the greatest achievement of the Schiller building, though, was its integration of all these various technologies into one unified building. And that, I think, is largely up to Sullivan, who was able to look at the very diverse forms that the theater and the tower and the bridge all gave him and find a way to unify it architecturally. Adler and Sullivan was what we think of today as a full service practice or an integrated practice. They did the building design, but they also did the building engineering. And of course, given the time, they also did a lot of the on-site supervision. So they were really interested in the wholesale realization of the building, not just one part of it. History has made it out to seem that Adler was the sort of engineering, the pragmatist of the bunch, and Sullivan was the artist, the creative member of the team. It was clearly more complicated than that. Their partnership, I think, thrived on the fact that, yes, they were from two different backgrounds. They were trained in two different disciplines, but they clearly had an affinity for the way the other one worked. And their skills were complementary, but very obviously were at their best when they were united, when they were working together. It's interesting to note Adler not only trained as an engineer, but also trained in the German tradition. Sullivan, of course, studied briefly at the Beaux-Arts, so he was from the French tradition. These two, I think you can see as being traditions that seem at odds in some ways, but actually work quite well together when they're fully integrated. And this, I think, is borne out not only by the success the partnership had while they were working together, but the fact that after their dissolution in 1895, neither one was really successful without the other. The major work that Sullivan completed allegedly on his own, Carson Peary Scott, was actually done with Adler as a consultant. The firm, I think, in that way was very forward-looking, that it was an integrated firm, something we're more used to today in firms that take on engineering and design. And their ability not only to do the work themselves, but to know when they needed help, to go hire consultants like William Sui Smith, who assisted with the foundations, also, I think, marks them as very modern in the sense that they understood both what their partnership was capable of, and also when a problem got too complex or too large for just them to handle it, they knew to go outside of the firm and to bring in expertise from other professional consultants. Sure, you're absolutely right, and it was mostly Jenny, I think, who inspired that sense of sharing. But Adler was absolutely part of it as well. They published their buildings. They were very free with information. They had their own societies, the Western Society of Engineers and the Western Society of Architects, who met regularly and would talk about, whatever the best practices were. Jenny, I think, was the instigator for a lot of that. And you're correct that almost everyone in Chicago worked in his office at one point or another. It's really remarkable, the names that came out of there. But I think he really set the tone. Adler was very good about writing. After he and Sullivan broke up, Adler had a regular column in Cassier's magazine, which was an engineering magazine. And when you read what they wrote today, we would think of a lot of it as like trade secrets, things that you wouldn't want your competing firms to know about. But I think that they were out in Chicago, out at the edge of civilization in some ways. And I think they realized that it was better for all of them if the whole profession in this city advanced, and not just as a competitive, not just in a competitive environment. Yeah, it is true. It was a relatively small community. Three or four firms in Chicago did almost all of the skyscraper work. Burnham, Halliburton, Roche, Jenny, Adler, and Sullivan. And after that, it drops off. There are a lot of firms that maybe did one or two. I get the sense that firms would try it and realize maybe that they weren't set up to be able to make money off of a project that complicated, or they would be underbid by Burnham's office in particular. But that was really the leadership, those four firms. And interestingly, one of the most interesting stories I found was that in 1885, when Burnham and Root designed the Rookery, which is one of the most famous of the 1880s Chicago buildings, they were actually the major investors in the building. And the reason that they wanted to build it was they wanted all of their consultants in one place. And their office was on the top floor. And because they brought in all of their engineers and contractors and whatever else, it meant that they could just run downstairs and talk to whomever they needed to. And I had a student once, I thought this was very insightful. They said that, the Rookery was like the 1880s internet or the 1880s Zoom, that Burnham did that very intentionally. Because that created the close collaboration that they really needed. So yes, you're absolutely right. I think that Berlin probably had a much larger architectural community than Chicago at the time, but even within the broader construction industry, architecture and engineering of high-rise buildings was a very, very small, very, very closely organized. We would say tight knit, right? Like very, very tight community.